Nature's Archive Podcast, a Jumpstart Nature production.
Hey everyone, if you've been following Nature's Archive for a while, you might be familiar with the idea of leave the leaves. It represents one simple act of omission, not raking, blowing, or mulching leaf fall. And it's resoundingly positive for the environment. But even if you think you know why leaving the leaves is helpful, I invite you to listen to today's guest, National Wildlife Federation naturalist David Mizejewski. If you're unfamiliar with David, let me tell you that his skill and enthusiasm for nature interpretation is second to none. Today, David walks us through all the ways leaves help the environment, and how bagging them up and sending them to the landfill makes a bad situation even worse. We also discuss useful tips for keeping leaves even if you have an HOA or difficult neighbors who might think you're neglecting your space. So, if you still have leaves in your yard, please listen and then take NWF's pledge to leave the leaves and reap the rewards for years to come. So without further delay, David Mizejewski. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. I'm excited to talk about leaving the leaves.
Yeah, and I think based on if we have longtime listeners listening right now, they're probably familiar with this concept, but I look forward to getting into a little more depth with you today. Now, before we jump into the leaves, I would love to just learn a little bit about yourself. So you're a naturalist at the NWF. How long have you been with the NWF?
I actually just celebrated my 25th anniversary working at National Wildlife Federation. I started all the way back in July of 2000, and I came actually initially to run our national program that we now call Garden for Wildlife, or our native plant habitat program, which is really all about helping people take their own little piece of the earth, their own yards or garden spaces, their community spaces, and reconnect them to nature, reconnect them to the ecosystem, primarily by planting native plants, by not using pesticides, and by doing things like keeping your leaves on your property, which has a whole bunch of benefits, which I'm sure we're going to get into in detail.
Absolutely. And you're so much more than a naturalist. You're an environmental educator, I would say. You're very active in that space. I'm curious, did this career pathway that you found yourself in, how did that come to be?
Well, that's a very long story, but the short version is that I feel like I was born with this innate love of nature. And I think probably a lot of your listeners can relate to that. So I really explained myself as a lifelong nature geek, and got to just learn about nature as a kid from firsthand experiences, just playing out in nature, which is something, sadly, that is not happening much anymore. But for me, I learned as much as I could. I read every book on nature. I watched every nature documentary. I went and got a degree in human and natural ecology, and I paired that with political science, thinking I would get involved in advocacy, until I realized that I'm not really good at advocacy. That's really tough work, and it's adversarial, and it's so critically important for conservation. But after that epiphany and realizing that's really not where I could best serve the cause of conservation, I didn't really know what to do. This was right after college. So I ended up getting a seasonal position as a naturalist in a nature camp. And what I learned from doing that is that what I'm good at and what I love is sharing my knowledge and my passion and my excitement. Again, all the nature geek stuff that is just in my DNA with other people. And so I did that for a summer, and I realized, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to be a science communicator. I want to be an educator. I want to be an interpreter of the natural world and use my passion as a force of good, hopefully to inspire other people to want to learn more, to want to get outside, and of course, want to get involved in conservation efforts. And so not too long after I graduated, only about 3 years, I was able to get hired at the National Wildlife Federation. And I know I'm pretty lucky to land my dream job at age 24, but it's what I do at the National Wildlife Federation, whether it's writing materials or curating content for our website and our blog, or I've written a book on this whole subject of natural gardening called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife, which got turned into an Animal Planet series, which I then hosted and got into doing on-camera work. And so for these last couple decades, any media opportunity that there is, like I said, written on camera, doing podcasts like this, I'm there. I want to get other people excited and learning about nature so they can get involved.
Since you said this has always been in your DNA, maybe this question is not a great question, but you can reimagine it so that maybe it makes a little more sense. But maybe in your formative years, was there a spark moment or some moment that really solidified this view that you had that like nature is where you wanted to be?
I can't identify one specific moment that led me to this career path that I've chosen, or that epiphany that I had like a conscious thought, like, this is what I want to do. But what I can say is that I know that the opportunity to be able to go out and explore nature as a kid that I was lucky to get back in the 80s. It was a little bit more common then, but the whole sort of Gen X trope of our parents opened the door and out we went and we didn't come home until they called us for dinner really is true. And looking back at my childhood and how hugely important that experience was to me, again, developing and honing this natural affinity that, like I said, I was born with, it was huge. It was so incredibly foundational. And of course, I read Ranger Rick magazine, which is published by the National Wildlife Federation. And I was a junior naturalist at our local nature center. And my parents signed me up to do fossil hunts, and all of those things, those youth experiences with nature really put me on the path to where I am today. And so I can't overemphasize how important it is to get kids outside in nature, because not everybody's going to grow up to be a professional naturalist, but anybody that as a kid gets to play in nature and just explore and experience is going to grow up to somebody who understands why it's important that we protect nature.
Leaning into that Gen X trope of like the door was open, you were on your own. Are there any moments you look back on, like an encounter with a copperhead or something like that you're like, oh, wow, I am lucky to have had that experience?
Well, thankfully, I think as far as kids go, I had sort of a natural caution and a natural respect for nature. So probably the worst thing that I did that could have turned out in a not so good way is I probably climbed too many trees and falling out of a tree in the middle of the woods and breaking your leg probably wouldn't have been good. But some of my friends were maybe a little bit less cautious. I do remember one time as probably 9 or 10-year-old boys, one of my friends thought it would be a really great idea to jam a stick into a yellow jacket hive tunnel that was in the stream bank. And we all stood there while he did it. And of course, we got swarmed and stung. And that probably was foolish. And if, God forbid, one of us was allergic, that could have turned out bad. But I really can't think of anything that was so scary that it would have been life-threatening. And I think it's a good question, because it's something that parents worry about today, right? Oh my gosh, if I let my kid out, they're gonna venomous snakes, they're gonna get eaten by a bear. And the risk of those things is so small.
So small.
And so, especially compared to other dangers that both kids and adults face on a daily basis, getting in a vehicle and driving to the grocery store is exponentially more dangerous than going into nature, right? Your domesticated dogs are far more dangerous than any wild animal in terms of the statistics on how often they harm people and even kill people. So I think perspective is really important, because I think our fear of nature is such a huge overreaction to any actual danger there is. And what we end up doing is cutting ourselves off from nature to our own detriment, particularly kids. So I think it's a good question, but I want to flip it on its head there.
Yeah, and I'm glad you took it that way, because that's the message that often comes out. And even in your case, you got stung by some yellow jackets. The aggregate benefit of all of the experiences that you had far outweighed that one somewhat negative encounter due to your friend.
Without question. And yes, thank you for acknowledging that it was not me that stuck the stick in the yellow jacket nest. It was a friend.
Yeah.
A less smart friend.
Yeah. So let's jump into the leaves. And I understand that it's already October, and October is Leave the Leaves month. So can you tell me what's the big picture for having a whole month about Leave the Leaves? Hey, Michael here. Great news. After such a long wait, Jumpstart Nature, my education and conservation organization, is now officially a 501c3 nonprofit. That's as of April 2025. This unlocks a bunch of great opportunities for us. Jumpstart Nature is who produces Nature's Archive and the Jumpstart Nature podcast. I started Jumpstart Nature to inspire you to take action to help nature. There is so much we all can do, even in times like this, where it feels like our institutions are failing us. So please help us continue our mission by donating to us at jumpstartnature.com/donate. A $5 per month donation goes a long way towards producing these shows. You can also support us through Patreon at jumpstartnature.com/Patreon, spelled Patreon. And by the way, for those of you using the Patreon app on an Apple device, please note that Apple adds on an additional fee. So if you use Patreon, you should contribute through their website instead to avoid that fee. And as always, we're looking for volunteers. If you've ever dreamed of meeting some of the guests we have on the show, producing a podcast, or just love editing audio and video, or even if you'd like to help us in our app development, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me a note at hello@jumpstartnature.com. Thank you for your support, and thanks for being part of our movement.
Yeah, so Leave the Leaves Month is something that the National Wildlife Federation has been doing for 3 years, where we've officially designated the month, and we're doing a whole targeted, really education and public awareness campaign centered around the idea of, in fall, when the trees lose their leaves, trying to keep those leaves on site as much as possible. And I'll unpack all of why that's important in a minute, but it's something that we've been promoting for literally decades. In fact, I recently found an old newspaper clipping of an interview that I did talking about why it's important to keep some of your fallen leaves on your property. That goes all the way back to 2003. So the idea of leaving the leaves is not a new one for us at the National Wildlife Federation, even if Leave the Leaves Month is a newer campaign. But the reason we talk about this, I mentioned a lot of my work at the National Wildlife Federation falls under our kind of Garden for Wildlife umbrella. And what that is all about is helping people realize that nature literally is all around us. It's not just in faraway places like wilderness or national parks. And we can actually restore many aspects of nature right in our own cities, towns, and neighborhoods, starting literally right outside our door in our own yards and garden spaces. And so when we think of that as an opportunity to reconnect the places where people live into the bigger ecosystem, so we're actually adding benefit and not just destroying and taking away and habitat destruction and pollution, which is typically what we think about the human impact on nature, right? This whole idea of gardening for wildlife, of planting native plants, of reducing our lawn, of not using pesticides, providing natural habitat through our garden spaces for songbirds and butterflies and native bees and other pollinators and so on and so forth. It's a really powerful act that we can all do. And especially in these very turbulent times where, just on a big scale, it seems like there's so many problems. The idea of taking that personal action by nurturing a natural habitat garden is, I think, really powerful. It's very uplifting to me personally when I can plant some, like right now, the asters and the goldenrods are blooming in my yard, which I live in New Jersey, by the way. And it's gorgeous and it's wonderful, but it's teeming with bees and late season monarchs on their migration down to Mexico. That lifts my spirits because I know that I nurtured that and I know it's doing something good. And so that's where the Leave the Leaves come in. This is part of this bigger set of work that we're doing at the National Wildlife Federation, encouraging these natural landscapes to the benefit of wildlife, but also people too. And the gist of it is pretty simple when you think about it. And so here's the basic concept. During the fall months in many places around the country, temperate climates, the deciduous trees and actually also the evergreens will lose their leaves or their needles. Obviously, evergreens don't lose them all, but they drop the foliage as they get ready for winter dormancy. And what happens to them? Well, they fall right down at the root zone where they suppress weeds, they retain soil moisture, and then they slowly compost and break down, returning the nutrients right to the root zone of those plants. That sounds an awful lot like mulch and fertilizer that is provided free by Mother Nature. So that's at a very surface level. The whole idea of leaving your leaves is just, hey, look, Mother Nature is providing us with this stuff that makes our garden soil better. It actually protects our plants and our landscapes. Why are we throwing it away when we could just be leaving it in place or moving it into our garden beds and using it as a natural mulch and fertilizer? The big lawn industry and the chemical industry has trained us as Americans that you have to get out there and rake and throw away your leaves or blow them, even worse, and then turn around and go buy mulch and fertilizer. So from that very simple point of view, we're trying to encourage people to be a little bit more sustainable. And oftentimes when you're sustainable, you save a buck, right? If you're recycling that natural leaf layer and using it as a natural mulch, natural fertilizer, well, you're going to save money because you don't have to go out and buy those things. So that's one kind of concept. The other big one is that the natural leaf layer that forms is crucially important wildlife habitat for all sorts of species. And again, we can get into the details of that, but that's really the gist of it. It's recycling natural material, keeping it out of the landfill, which is super important. And it's also about providing wildlife habitat. And again, we can go a little bit deeper into both of those.
Yeah, for sure. And you said something that I wanted to dig into here before we get a little bit deeper. You said we've been taught to clean up our yards, rake the leaves, or worse, blow the leaves. So tell me why blowing is worse.
Leaf blowers are super popular and they require fuel. And that fuel either is in the form of basically gasoline or even electric. They make the job easier, no doubt, but they also are terribly polluting. Not just air pollution, which is bad. The motors on gasoline-powered lawn equipment, this is lawnmowers, weed whackers, as well as leaf blowers, are not regulated the same way that, say, our car engines are. And so their emissions are through the roof. Particulate matter, but also carbon pollution, which is causing climate change, right? So when we're out there burning that gasoline, blowing all the leaves, you are contributing in a small way to your own carbon footprint that is fueling global climate change. So that's bad. And again, the particulate matter is bad to breathe. But the other reason why leaf blowers are bad is that they cause tremendous noise pollution. And there have been studies looking at the leaf blowers and lawnmowers and other lawn and garden care equipment interfering with birds and bird song. And quite honestly, just from a very selfish point of view, they're just freaking obnoxious. And I learned this moving from working in an office pre-pandemic to now being a full-time remote employee, and just how loud and ubiquitous leaf blowers are in suburbia. It really was shocking to me. So much so that oftentimes I have to have my window shut. It's a gorgeous day today, beautiful early fall weather, but I can't have my window open because you would hear through this microphone that I'm recording on all of the leaf blowers that are happening right now in this very moment because the leaves are starting to fall. And it's horrible. You can't hear nature. And so anyway, that's a little soapbox about that. And here's the thing. Look, I know it's harder to rake, but raking is quiet. And it's good exercise for us, right? So if you are going to move your leaves, and again, I'm going to hopefully convince folks listening why maybe you don't want to, or at least not all of them. If you do need to move your leaves like off your lawn or for whatever reason, try to use a rake. It's better for you physically. It's better for the environment. If you have to use a leaf blower, and I recognize that there are times and places where that's going to be the best solution, try to go with an electric one, still based on fossil fuels, but much less polluting, both in terms of emissions as well as noise pollution.
Yeah, absolutely. I have found myself becoming more and more sensitive to the leaf blowing noises as I get older. And I don't know if it's just something I'm just more attuned to or if there's just so much more of it now than there used to be. Very often I'll be working from home, have to keep the window shut and endure an uncomfortably warm room combined with the lack of nature exposure that I would otherwise get through the window. So yeah, it's a lose.
Yeah. It's a lose-lose, exactly.
So you mentioned that leaves are incredibly important part of, their habitat. And I was telling you before we started that my background is in like network systems. So I very often think of the world in terms of systems. And of course, we all live as part of the largest, most complex system that exists, the ecosystem that we're part of. So these leaves, can you maybe get into some of the details of who they're supporting, what they're supporting, like just to maybe kick it off, I want to tell you about one of my favorite learnings of these last few years, and that's about leaf mining insects that are literally sometimes inside a leaf pupating when the leaf falls off, and they complete their life cycle then on the ground after that leaf falls off. And I know there's so many other important stories of beneficial insects or other organisms as well.
Absolutely. And you know what? I thank you for pointing out leaf miners. That is not one group of wildlife that we focus much on at the National Wildlife Federation during Leave the Leaves month. So maybe they'll get the spotlight next year in our campaign. But yeah, I mean, that's a great example because it's hidden from our view for the most part, but it's a role that our fallen leaves are playing for a whole suite of species, right? The leaf mining insects. And so let's start with the invertebrates, the insects, the earthworms, and the snails. And the leaf layer, again, naturally forms when trees and shrubs lose their leaves, and the herbaceous vegetation too will go dormant in winter months or the dry season, depending on people's climate conditions and their regional differences. But at any rate, in many ecosystems, you do have this natural layer of dead vegetation that kind of sits on top of the soil. And of course, anytime anything out in nature is going to ultimately be used as a resource by something. And so within and underneath that leaf layer is all sorts of life. And a lot of it is invertebrate life. And so again, some of the animals I just mentioned are, I think most people logically think of them. Oh yeah, earthworms and snails and things like that. Isopods. Depending on where you grew up, you might call them roly-polies, or you might call them pill bugs, you might call them potato bugs. These are these little terrestrial crustaceans. They tend to be grayish. They live in the leaf layer because they actually have gills. They breathe through gills. And the leaf layer, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, traps moisture. It helps keep moisture in the soil, which is beneficial to all the plants out there. But it actually provides a safe place for these isopods, which are fantastic decomposers. They eat decaying plant material, and they can actually metabolize and break down toxic metals in the soil. So they're really good for pollution mitigation too. And they're doing this job all around us, out of sight, out of mind. But if you don't have a leaf layer, they don't exist. They can't be there. The ground will just get too dry. But some of the invertebrate species that I think most people don't realize need that fallen leaf layer include things like bumblebees. Now, most of our native bee species, we've got 4,000 or so here in North America, do not live in hives like the non-native honeybee does, right? They don't have queens, they don't make honey, none of that. And they will typically overwinter as pupa in hollowed out plant stems or in tunnels in dead or dying trees. But our bumblebees are social bees, and they do form hives, and they do have queens. Now, the hive does not survive when winter comes, but the queen does, or a queen does. And guess where she goes? She buries herself underneath the fallen leaves in a little burrow, and those leaves not only keep moisture there so she doesn't dry out, but they provide insulation. Think of like your winter coat. It's got insulating material in it, or your comforter. Well, those leaves do the same thing. They trap little pockets of air that stay warmer than the surrounding environment. And so especially, in areas where there's snow, you get even more insulation. But at any rate, our bumblebee queens need the leaf layer. But the one that I think really blows people's minds the most in terms of insects that use the leaf layer are butterflies and moths, right? We think of butterflies and moths as the adult form, they're flying around. We think of pollinator gardens, and it's always about planting lots of flowering plants and maybe caterpillar host plants. But what do these insects do during the winter months? Well, many of them, moths in particular, will pupate in the leaf layer over the winter. It's so complex. And many of our like giant silk moths, so, things like the Luna moth and the Cecropia moth and the Io moth and the Polyphemus moth, these big honkin', quite beautiful moths, they have these large caterpillars, as you would expect from a large moth species. They grow up on their caterpillar host plant. It's different for each of the different species. But when fall comes, what they'll do is they will spin their silken cocoon and wrap it in a leaf. And then that leaf will fall off the tree and lives and exists in that fallen leaf layer. Again, where it's insulated and the pupa stays in that form throughout the winter. That is how these insect species survive the winter. And then come spring, they'll emerge as the adults and they'll repeat the process. So the reason you might be thinking, well, why do I care about moths? Well, moths are pollinators, but they're also part of the food web. And when you know that 96% of our backyard birds feed their babies exclusively a diet of insects, mostly caterpillars and mostly moth caterpillars, you can really easily just thread the needle from your fallen leaves right now at this time of year and bird populations next spring. Because without those moth caterpillars, parent birds are not going to be able to successfully raise their babies. And most people love seeing beautiful birds in their yard. So that's my pitch, everybody. If you want to see birds, especially if you want to see baby birds in your yard next year, leave your leaves this fall, because many of our moths that are going to feed those birds next year need that as their overwintering area. I could go on and on. There's so many more examples, but...
Yeah, I like the caterpillar example. And we had Dr. Doug Ptolemy on the podcast, and his lab did a study of chickadees. I forget which species.
I believe it was Carolina chickadees.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Doug is a good friend of National Wildlife Federation. And so a lot of the stats that I just quoted you come from his research. Yeah, but took one pair of chickadees in order to raise one nest of babies. They had to catch between 6,000 and 9,000 insects over like a 16-day nesting event. And they only foraged within about 150 feet or so from that nest. So this is wildlife conservation on the scale of your own yard. Think about it. If you had an oak tree that's supporting lots of caterpillars and also a nesting place for chickadees potentially in your yard, and you've kept the leaves so the chickadees have the place to forage for the food and for the moth caterpillars to emerge, etc., versus a lawn and maybe a few non-native plants that didn't support any moth caterpillars. That's a stark difference. And it's one that, unfortunately, most people have the lawn and the non-native plants. And so it's no wonder that our North American songbird populations have plummeted over the last 50 or so years. It's no wonder that the monarch butterfly is literally disappearing in our own lifetime, because a big piece of the puzzle is how we treat our landscapes and our cities, towns, and neighborhoods, including our own yards. And if we have nothing but lawn and nothing but non-native plants and we're spraying pesticides everywhere, these wildlife are going to disappear. And it's happening. But the message here is that we have agency here. We have choice. We could do very simple things like leaving our fallen leaves, using them as natural mulch, reducing our lawn, planting more natives, don't spray pesticides, etc. These are simple things we can all do. And oftentimes they save us money and time. And at the same time, they provide tremendous, enormous benefit to our wild neighbors, the songbirds, the pollinators, etc. It's such a win-win thing to do that I really hope people will be inspired to try it out this year. Keep some of your leaves on your property. Don't bag them up. Don't send them to the landfill, which is really the worst place for them. But yeah, that's really what it's all about.
And maybe you could talk a little bit more about the soil health aspect, because you said it's like a natural mulch. And I know a lot of people that have a highly maintained property, they'll put mulch down, but every so often they'll rake up and replace the mulch as well. In this case, the leaves are breaking down, creating soil, probably better aerated soil, which has benefits too. So can you tell me a little bit about the soil benefits, and then how that also, aside from just bringing more nutrients back to, say, the tree that dropped the leaves in the first place, how it benefits the plants that already exist in that space?
Yeah, I mean, you've pretty much summed it up, what the benefit is there, right? If we allow what happens in nature, which is for those fallen leaves and other dead vegetation, to just naturally compost in place at the foot of the plants that they fell off of, they are going to, as they are consumed by the decomposers like the isopods and the earthworms, which then excrete waste, which is concentrated nutrients that used to be in those leaves, that helps build healthy soils. Now, depending on what region you're in, you're going to have different kinds of soils and different vegetation. But speaking broadly, this is what happens, right? This is how healthy soil is formed for plants to grow in, regardless of what region you're in, right? And so when we literally throw that away, there's no way for the soil to regenerate itself. And that's why you then have to go out and buy fertilizer, because you've taken away all of those nutrients that otherwise would have recharged that soil health and become available to the roots of the plants. You mentioned aeration as well. Our urban soils and even suburban soils can be pretty hard packed. I live in suburban New Jersey, not too far outside of New York City, but my house has been here for almost 100 years. And we have clay soil here. And let me tell you, it's hard packed. 100 years of people walking on it and doing whatever has really compacted the soil down. So I moved here about 5 years ago. And one of my big goals has been not only to reduce the size of the lawn, which I've done probably about at least half of my lawn, which used to be the whole yard, has now been converted into garden beds. But my second big focus really has been to build the soil. And I've been using fallen leaves to do that for the last 5 years. And I'm finally at this stage getting some pretty good native type woodland soil, which would be the sort of the native historical type soil where I live. And it's pretty amazing to see the transformation, to be able to actually dig in it instead of just hitting like concrete, the hard clay, and getting I've got a lot of trees, so it's shady. And so that's a tough gardening challenge. There's not a lot of plants that are going to do really well in full shade, but I'm relying on woodland wildflowers and ferns, all native species to where I live. And most of those do require a rich forest soil humus type situation, which I did not have. But because I have each year put a layer in my yard, what works for me is about 3 to 5 inches of fallen leaves that come from my trees. But I am also the crazy guy that goes down my street with a big tarp and rakes my neighbor's leaves. My neighbors put them all out to the curb to be collected. I will take those and I will drag them down the street into my yard to make this nice natural mulch layer. And it really is benefiting not only my plants, but also I know that I'm supporting more wildlife because I know how many creatures actually depend on that leaf layer.
I am just visualizing you going down the street with a tarp and what people might think, but we should normalize that behavior.
100%. I call myself a nature geek and I wear my geek flag proudly. And hopefully I'm inspiring other people to not be so worried about it and to maybe keep some of this incredible natural resource out of the landfill and on our property. And I do want to actually talk about the landfill for a second.
Sure.
Because again, I was saying there's really 2 main reasons to leave your leaves. One is to just use this material rather than throwing it away. The other is wildlife habitat. But as far as that first one goes, as far as throwing it away, not only are you denuding your own yard, but what ends up happening when you throw those leaves away is that they end up in the landfill. And as organic material, once they get buried in anaerobic conditions, because there's not oxygen in the landfill, when those organic materials break down, they produce methane, which is, we talked about climate change and the fossil fuels and the pollution from our lawnmowers and leaf blowers. Methane blows all of that out of the water. And our landfills are the 3rd largest source of methane pollution. And methane is like a super potent greenhouse gas trapping heat in our atmosphere, again, contributing to global climate change. And so again, the 3rd biggest source of methane. And a big portion of that is coming from yard waste, which is largely made up of fallen leaves, as well as grass clippings and maybe some woody debris. But it's mind-blowing when you think about it. That's something that absolutely do not have to do, bag up our leaves and throw them in the landfill, is still happening at such a huge level, and it's causing such a huge emission of this really potent greenhouse gas. So don't throw them out. Keep them on your property. That's the number one message from the National Wildlife Federation. There's lots of different ways you can use them if you keep them on your property. The most natural, of course, is just leave them where they fall. And that's great. That's what happens in nature. That's wonderful. Now, I mentioned earlier, they will smother your lawn if you have a thick layer. A light scattering of leaves is no big deal for a lawn, but yeah, you might need to move them off of your lawn, either because you just want to for aesthetics, or maybe you live in an HOA that is going to demand that you do it or fine you and that kind of thing. So that's where you get your rake out and you rake them into your garden beds. If you don't have enough garden beds, maybe this is a perfect opportunity to add a few extra, cut into that lawn, turn it into a garden bed that you fill with beautiful native wildflowers and trees and shrubs or whatever vegetation is by you, and use that fallen leaf layer right there as a natural mulch. That is probably the most practical thing for most people to do. Most people are not going to be able to just leave them right where they fall. I mentioned HOAs. We do a survey each year for Leave the Leaves Month. And this year's survey showed that 40% of respondents actually are required by their HOA or by municipal landscape ordinances to remove the leaves from their lawn at least. So we know that's a thing for a lot of people. But so again, the most practical thing is use those leaves as a natural mulch. If you have too many leaves, even for that, put them in a compost pile. Just make a leaf pile in the back of your property somewhere, and they'll naturally compost. You could also shred them or run them over with a mulching lawnmower type scenario, and that's better than throwing them away. But just remember, you're chopping up all the wildlife that are in them, like those moth caterpillars. But I don't want anybody to feel guilty for doing that if that's your only option. The most important thing is to keep them from getting tossed into the landfill, because it's just insult to injury. Not only are you taking away the habitat, not only are you taking away the free natural resource of mulch and fertilizer, but then you're contributing to methane production from landfills, which is just an awful thing. So if nothing else, just commit to keeping them out of the landfill and use as many as you can on your property, and then compost or shred or mulch the rest.
Yeah, the landfill aspect that you just touched on, that's news to me. Of course, I knew methane was a big problem at landfills. I had no idea that a good chunk of that is coming from leaves and organic matter that we're throwing out.
Yeah, it's something like 10 million tons of yard waste gets buried in the landfill every year. That's a lot. And so that's preventable. We can keep most of that out. I have not, in the 5 years that I've lived here, I have not thrown away a single leaf. And I still actually have some lawn. That's where my dogs play fetch. And when we have parties, people mingle or whatever. The lawn is the people habitat. And of course, I don't put pesticides or fertilizers or any of that stuff on it. But the rest of my yard are just these beautiful garden beds, like I said, filled with native wildflowers and trees and shrubs that are providing habitat. And pretty soon here, I'm going to be out there with my rake, moving the leaves that fall on the lawn into the garden beds as the perennials are going dormant. It's a nice blanket that's going to protect them. And then over the winter and into the spring, they'll naturally compost and break down and fertilize those plants and build the soil. Everybody can do this.
Yeah, and you started to touch on the aesthetics problem and some of the workarounds that you have there, whether it's like your own kind of self-perception of your property or an HOA-driven requirement. Maybe it's peer pressure from your neighbors. I don't know if you have any other tips or suggestions as to how to get past some of those different impediments that someone might run into.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because this is such a huge issue. And it's also one that is so overblown. I hear so much resistance each year when I'm out here talking about leaving the leaves from people who just they freak out and they're like, oh my gosh, it's going to look ugly. And I'm like, take a deep breath. It's all cool. Like, is that really, with everything going on in the world, what you're going to be worrying about right now, that it's not going to be quote unquote neat and tidy? So I think some of this is just sort of perception, and we have an opportunity to be mindful about how we are perceiving things and what our reactions are to them. But I will say this, it's maybe a little bit of a different aesthetic than buying bagged, shredded hardwood mulch. When you're talking about using fallen leaves in your garden beds, maybe it's a little bit more rough, maybe a little bit more rustic, but really not that much, right? And so some tips I can offer are to help minimize that if that's not your jam, right? If natural looking is not your aesthetic, or you're worried about, again, an HOA coming after you. Couple tips I can give. Number one, move the leaves into your garden beds. That in and of itself is going to clear them off the lawn and give a perception of tidiness. But another pro tip is use an edge. So make a delineated edge with like a shovel and cut an edge around that garden bed. And you would be surprised at how far that goes into communicating visually. Like, I am doing this with a deliberate plan in mind, and it's part of the aesthetic, versus somebody just assuming that you're lazy and didn't want to do your yard work, right? An edge is really powerful to communicate that. You can also do things like incorporate decorative features. Maybe you have a little statue, or maybe you're one of the folks that have gone as far as to participate in our program at National Wildlife Federation that we call Certified Wildlife Habitat. And this is where we recognize people with a little yard sign that says, this is a habitat, and I've done this on purpose. I've planted native plants. And so maybe you have your Certified Wildlife Habitat sign out in your garden bed with the fallen leaves. But just being intentional and doing little things like that can communicate to your neighbors that this is a thing. Another thing that people really freak out about so unnecessarily is they're like, what about the wind? The wind's going to blow the leaves everywhere. And I am here to tell you, at least anecdotally from my own personal experience, that's such a non-issue. I have pictures that I have taken in my yard in November and January and March of my beds where, when I first moved the leaves in, and then after a windstorm, and then 3 months later. And yeah, maybe there's a couple leaves that blew out onto my lawn, but it's so minimal, it's just not an issue. And guess what? If a few leaves blow on your lawn, number one, it's not going to hurt your lawn. Number two, just get the rake out and move them off. Not a big deal at all. But like the histrionics that people get into trying to justify why I have to throw my leaves away is very silly to me sometimes, especially since I've been doing this. And I know from firsthand experience that a lot of this stuff just really is not that big of a deal. So yeah, rake them off your lawn. You want to get fallen leaves off of sidewalks and walkways. We want to keep accessibility in mind, and wet leaves can be slippery and that kind of thing. Absolutely. But for the most part, you can do this in a way that isn't going to make your yard just look like a wild mess, and you're going to get all the benefits.
Yeah, and I guess one other tip I would throw in there as well. So this is a little bit different because it wasn't so much about leaving the leaves, but when I tore up my front yard and replaced it all with native plants, it was a good opportunity while I was working on it and while the work was being done to chat with neighbors when they walked by and tell them, like, this is what I'm doing and then this is why. And I found it, by and large, everyone was very supportive of it. And a few folks were like, can you tell me where you got the plants, and asking questions. Now, my neighborhood might be a little more progressive in that sense than the average neighborhood. And I'm very lucky that my immediate neighbors are great and have no issues whatsoever. I could definitely see if you had a very problematic relationship with a neighbor, like anything could set them off. But nonetheless, just that community element is probably a helpful step as well.
So important. And again, I'm really glad you brought that up. We all need more community in our country at this time in its history, right? And talking to each other and finding common ground, I think, is so critically important. And one way we can do that is to spend some time outside in our yards and engage with our neighbors. It doesn't even have to be about lawns or native plants or leaves, but that's a good one, right? But yeah, talk to your neighbors. Absolutely. And there's no better opportunity than when you're out doing a little bit of yard work, when your neighbors are walking their dog, or maybe they're doing their own yard work, right? When we're cooped up inside and separate from each other, we don't have those opportunities. And yes, it is such a powerful tool when it comes to minimizing pushback against a more natural landscape aesthetic. Because as we talked about earlier, it's really important that we do this. We're trashing habitat, and in many ways, the places where people live become dead zones where it doesn't really support much other life. And that does not have to be the case, right? These simple things that we all have the power to do, planting native plants, reducing lawn, reducing or eliminating pesticides, can overnight quite dramatically increase the habitat for a whole host of wildlife species that can safely coexist right alongside us if we just give them some habitat. Again, the songbirds, the butterflies, all the other cool beneficial insects, the small and medium-sized mammals that are out there doing their job as predators or prey or whatever, right? Like having wildlife around us and nature around us, we know from study after study, benefits us mentally and emotionally and even physically. Doing yard work is great exercise. Planting, gardening is great physical activity for us. Huge benefits to kids and their mental and emotional and physical development as well. So yeah, the whole idea of planting a wildlife garden seems so silly and so inconsequential, but it really is the exact kind of thing that can change the world, because it's the epitome of the idea of thinking globally but acting locally. And when we all do that, it really adds up exponentially. And we really can move the needle on a lot of bad news when it comes to wildlife conservation and the health of the planet and our communities, right? So I think the community piece is really critically important. Got to get out and talk to your neighbors.
So many things that you've touched on already in this discussion that are just so important. And I keep coming back to, I don't know that any one element stands above the rest in terms of personal well-being and agency and community and all, and just, of course, fundamentally helping wildlife. But that sense of agency, I keep coming back to that as you're talking and how important that is. And especially like for me, this is just, I'm not guessing that everyone would do the same thing I do, but I've turned into an iNaturalist sort of fanatic. And I am frequently going out and surveying my yard. And that's that novelty of like, hey, this is a new thing. What is this thing? And then finding out that it requires a certain host plant. And that's why it's here. Like you can connect the dots really easily at that point and be like, this thing is alive in my yard because of what I did.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, I love that example because it's a great illustration of how we can actually use technology to help deepen our connection to nature. There's this artificial divide that sometimes gets perpetuated of like, oh, we're overly technological and we're too dependent and we spend all day with our face in our phones, and that those things are mutually exclusive. And you know, maybe as a tech guy, you'll get this intuitively, but these are just tools, right? And we can use them in many ways to actually deepen our connection to nature. And the advent of things like iNaturalist or the Merlin app from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which will identify the bird songs around you, these things are tremendous opportunities to get people more engaged in being naturalists. You know, a naturalist, I'm a naturalist, that's my title. Anybody can be a naturalist, right? Charles Darwin was a naturalist. David Attenborough, Jane Goodall, who just recently passed away, these are famous naturalists. The local nature center, the woman that works there, she's a naturalist. Your national park folks, they're naturalists. Anybody can be a naturalist. It's really just about having an interest in nature and wanting to learn about it. And for me, personally, in my role as naturalist, I think it's also about being a communicator and being able to share that knowledge with other people to help interpret what's going on in the natural world and inspire them to want to learn more and also to get involved in protecting nature. For me, that's a key part of being a naturalist, but not everybody has that skill set. And if it's literally just about learning and observing and enjoying, that's being a naturalist too. So right. I do encourage everybody, get an old-fashioned field guide, join your birding club, download an app, whatever it takes to pique your interest. I say it's all good.
Yeah, I take the opportunity to show my neighbors pictures I've taken of things in my yard and share that passion. And like, hey, if we just look, like I'm not going to get on my soapbox with my neighbors. It's a little different kind of approach that you take. But the moral of the story is always, I just was looking and look at this amazing thing that was right here under my nose the whole time. So circling back then to, you said that this is the third year of Leave the Leaves month?
That's right. Yeah. Okay. So we decided to do this campaign just 3 years ago and really focus our efforts at the National Wildlife Federation on getting this message about leaving the leaves in a very targeted way instead of just doing it passively. And so this year we have launched something kind of neat that we're hoping everybody out there listening will do. And that is to take the Leave the Leaves pledge. And this is super easy. It's literally just clicking the button saying, I pledge to make the commitment to leave some of my leaves. And of course, that puts you in touch with us. So we'll be able to send you more information via email about natural gardening, about local ecology, and how you can get your own yard or garden space certified as a wildlife habitat with the National Wildlife Federation. It's really creating a communication stream. There's something psychological when we take a pledge that is a little bit more impactful than just thinking, I'm going to do this, right? If even that simple act of just clicking the pledge does have an impact in getting people to actually do the thing you're asking them to do. And we have a goal this year. We're trying to get 10,000 people to do it, which in the grand scheme is not that many people. So if folks want to take the pledge and access a bunch of information about leaving the leaves, they can go to our website. So it's nwf.org, as in National Wildlife Federation, nwf.org/leave the leaves. And the pledge is there, certification for your garden is there. And each year for Leave the Leaves Month, we put together some new content that we'll put out on our social media or our blog. And this year we have this really awesome quiz. It's before we quiz you, we give you the information. It's a photo essay on looking at some of those giant moth species I talked about earlier and showing you what the moth looks like, and then showing you what its cocoon looks like wrapped in the dead leaf. And then we actually have photos of those cocoons in a landscape. And so the quiz, like, you have to look and try to find the cocoon. And let me tell you, I got 2 of them wrong. I could not see them as a trained naturalist because they are that well camouflaged in the fallen leaves. So anyway, nwf.org/leave the leaves. That's where you can take the pledge. You can do this fun quiz and test your ability to spot the animals in the leaf layer. Lots of good stuff.
Sounds like a lot of fun. I'll check that out here today. In fact, before it slips my mind, I'm going to include this in my newsletter as well. So Wonderful. I'll try to help get the word out. Now, before we wrap up, I'm curious, you talked about the different things you've done in your own property and how you haven't let a leaf go to the landfill in so many years.
5
now.
years.
Yeah, so many years. Have there been any standout moments where you maybe discovered one of these caterpillars or something else that you would not have been aware of had you not been leaving the leaves?
Oh gosh, I can't think of one standout moment because almost every day I am out puttering in my yard and seeing a cool beetle or spotting a bird that probably wouldn't have been there because it was foraging in the leaf layer. And things that are out there in the world, but they rarely show up in people's yards. I had an eastern towhee show up in my yard, and it was foraging. This is a bird species that forages for food in the fallen leaves. And I actually didn't see it with my own eyes. I have little wildlife cameras scattered around my yard so that I can see what's going on when I'm not actually out there or at night. We have an incredible number of rabbits and foxes that are constantly running through the yard, but they're nocturnal, so you don't see them during the day. But yeah, seeing monarch butterflies coming and laying eggs on my milkweed is pretty powerful, especially knowing what trouble that species is in right now. So yeah, things like that. Hearing screech owls and knowing that because I and my neighbors and my community have emphasized keeping our mature trees in this community, and knowing that those screech owls, based on their calls, are in their courtship behavior. Those are just a few moments that I can think of in my own yard. I did put out a screech owl nesting box and a pine tree. I don't have any dead trees with tree cavities, which is where the screech owls are going to nest. So hopefully the screech owl nesting box will pique their interest and I'll get them actually nesting in my own yard in this big mature pine tree.
Yeah, so many things every day, every week that this leads to. And I love to hear the parallels too, because you're talking about the eastern towhee. We have the California towhee here. And if you have mulch, people sometimes get frustrated with the towhees because they dig so much and mess up the mulch. But if you're leaving the leaves, it's not an issue at that point. Yeah. They can do their thing naturally and it's not messing anything up.
Right, exactly. You know, I'm glad you mentioned that because there is one other thing that we haven't talked about. That is something that listeners in California and other parts of the West might have to face in a way that Easterners generally don't, or not as often, and that is fire safety. And this is one sort of caveat to the Leave the Leaves message, and that is you don't want to, if you're in an area that is prone to fire or there's high risk of fire, you want to follow best practice when it comes to fire safety protocol and defensible space and things like that. And so if you are following those protocols and it's conflicting with this message of leaving the leaves, please follow the fire safety protocol. That said, wildfires are not just a thing of the West anymore. In fact, here in New York, in New Jersey, and on the border with New York, last summer, we had a raging wildfire that lasted for weeks. And so at any rate, it's a growing issue. We developed a resource on how you can have sort of natural landscapes that are also fire safe. And you can find that on the National Wildlife Federation's website as well. You can just Google Fire Safe Landscapes, National Wildlife Federation, and we have that tip sheet. We also did an article on it in National Wildlife Magazine. But the bigger message there is adapt this Leave the Leaves message for the region that you live in. It's all going to be slightly different. We're a very diverse country ecologically, and maybe you don't have a lot of leaves where you are, and that's fine. Maybe you do. Maybe fire's an issue. So just go with the local flow and follow the best practices for safety and do as much as you can to keep the leaves on your property safely to benefit wildlife and the local ecosystem.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And it's a very nuanced one, too, when it comes to fire protection and what you can do in that space. Hopefully, I can have a thorough episode on that in the future. It's something I've been working on. But that said, we're nearing an end of our time allotment here, and I really appreciate you taking the time and telling us about this great new focus on Leave the Leaves, a little more of a deliberate, directed focus that I hope continues to move the message forward. And before we go, though, you do so much in the science communication space and so much for the National Wildlife Federation. Where can people find you and keep track of what you're up to? Do you have social media, a personal website, other resources?
Yeah, social media is a great way to keep in touch. I'm pretty much on all the places. If you could spell my last name, you will find me. It's Mizejewski, and I'm sure you can find that in the show notes, how to spell it. But yeah, I'm on most social media platforms. So is the National Wildlife Federation. So I would encourage you to give NWF a follow as well. And that's a really great way. If you have a question, I try to be really active and present and responsive. Not everybody can do that, but I do spend time trying to engage with folks. So if you have questions, I love hearing from folks. So please do follow.
Kudos to you for being able to do that. It's so hard to keep up with social media, and I do appreciate the outreach that you do. Do you have any other projects or anything else you'd like to highlight? Is there something happening in the month of December, for example, or anything else you want to point to?
We don't have a campaign per se, although we do have some great resources on artificial versus real Christmas trees. If people want to read up on which one's more sustainable, I won't spoil it. If you Google it, you'll find the articles. But yeah, for me personally, last year I had a series come out on a platform called The Great Courses. This is an online learning platform. It's an app and you could stream it. And I did a series called Field Guide to North American Wildlife. So it was 12 episodes of 30-minute deep dives into some of my favorite and some of the most interesting and unique wildlife species we have here right in the US. So that is out and available. I'm currently working on a new series that won't be out until 2027 because I got to write it and then I got to record it. But the new one is going to be called Secrets of Backyard and Urban Wildlife. And I'm actually going to do 18 episodes, and we're going to do a deep dive on a lot of the things we've touched on here today. Like, what does it take for a moth to go through its life cycle in suburbia? The episode I'm writing right now is called All Snakes Are Good. My challenge for myself is to write this in a way that even somebody who has the mentality of the only good snake is a dead snake will have their minds changed. So you can stay tuned for that. That'll be, again, we're shooting for spring of 2027.
Both of those sound amazing. I've listened to some of the great courses in the past and generally very high quality outputs that they have. So super cool. Do I hear a blue jay in the background?
You did. Good ear. And this is how loud blue jays are. I have my windows shut like we were talking about. And so, yes, the blue jays are out in full force, squawking it up. So
yeah, it brings back memories. We don't get blue jays here in California. We have different jays, but I grew up in the Midwest, so they were a common species. Anyway, with that fun note, I would like to thank you again for taking the time today. And I appreciate you and the work that you and the National Wildlife Federation are doing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. And happy Leave the Leaves Month.
Thanks for sticking through the entire episode. If you made it this far, I hope that it means that you enjoyed it. If so, please spread the word and share this episode with 3 friends or groups that you think would enjoy it too. As for today's episode, let me know. Did I miss anything? Was there a topic I should have covered? Let me know at podcast@jumpstartnature.com or DM me on any of my social accounts. I'll do my best to answer your questions. You can find me at Nature's Archive, one word, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I also share photography, nature stories, and much more on those accounts, so you can follow just to stay in touch, too. And despite being called crazy by numerous friends and colleagues, last year I left my tech career behind to start Jumpstart Nature, which Nature's Archive is now part of. For the sake of myself, my family, and the planet, I need to make this work. So please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/jumpstartnature. I offer some exclusive content and perks, and you can start donations as low as $4 a month. Lastly, please also check out our latest creation. It's the Jumpstart Nature podcast. Each episode reveals an unseen, surprising, or misunderstood nature topic with the help of experts and our host, Griff Griffith. It's entertaining and inspiring, and even reached number 3 on the Apple Nature podcast charts. There's much more on our roadmap, but we need your support, so check out jumpstartnature.com for more details. Thank you.